And leading into that, we paused to think about what we talked about a little bit last week, just a quick summary. And we talked about Paul dealt with judging others, primarily talking about those Jewish Christians who were still clinging to the old law and trying to tell the Gentile Christians, look, you've got to keep these things. You've got to be circumcised. You've got to do all these other things if you want to be a Christian. You can't be a Christian without doing these. And Paul says, look, the very law that you're trying to enforce upon them, you don't keep yourself. Really, the only thing that you've kept is that you were circumcised, and somebody did that to you when you were 8 days old. So he says you're relying on a covenant that you're not even really trying to keep yourself. And so as chapter 2 concluded, Paul emphasized that it was more important to live the life of faith under the law of faith and have that circumcision of the heart done by God than it was to strive to live the law of Moses, the law of works, the law of circumcision, and to rely upon it for our salvation, because our salvation is found in the law of faith. Our salvation is found in Christ, not under this ability to keep that law of Moses. And so this week, Paul continues with the comparison, and we begin there, Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. And as I said when we started, we're not going to look at every verse, so we'll be jumping around a little bit here in just a second. But we want to start with these first 4 verses because Paul continues this comparison about Jewish Christians and their ideal or their concept about how much greater they were, how much more important they were than the Gentile Christians. And so he writes to them, what advantage then is there in being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision? Much in every way. First of all, the Jews have been entrusted with the very words of God. What if some were unfaithful? Will their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. Let God be true, and every human being be a liar, as it is written, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. Now, Paul addresses this question of the value of being a Jew. And for those Jewish Christians, they had this puffed up, elevated view of themselves. Again, they were used to being called God's chosen people. They were used to being part of a covenant that set them apart from everybody else. And under that law, under that covenant, if somebody wanted to live under that covenant, they did have to come in and do the things of the law. And so they're working off of that concept. They're working off of that level of importance that they have assigned to themselves. And so Paul begins with this question, what value is it? What is the advantage? Because if they're hearing Paul right, there is no advantage to it. All that meant nothing. And so verse 2, Paul says, no, there is a value to it. The value is this. God chose to give you his word. From the writings of Moses, first 5 books, all the way through the law, the prophets. So God has chosen to give you all of this, to teach you about who he is, about what he's trying to do, what he's trying to accomplish. And you were part of a covenant. You were supposed to be God's chosen people. And there was value in that. But the value was there as long as you kept the covenant. we've talked about this in other lessons before. When we talk about covenant, we're talking about an agreement, a contract between God and the Jewish people, especially when we're talking about the covenant of the law of Moses. And it was, you'll be my people, you'll be set apart from the world, I'll have special blessings for you, I'll give you this promised land, I'll do all these things for you if you will keep these things that I give you. Here are the terms of your contract. As long as you keep the terms of the contract, I'll keep my side of the contract. It doesn't take very long reading in the Old Testament to realize how long it took before the Jewish people began to break their side of the contract. And so Paul's reminding them, the covenant, God had the right to end the covenant at any point that he wanted because you didn't keep your side. Now, God kept it in place for a long time. He kept saying, okay, you broke it. I'm going to send some punishment. Your heart's going to get right. I'm going to bring you back. We'll stay with the covenant. We'll keep going a little while. When the time was finally right, he sent Jesus to bring the end to that covenant. And we're going to talk about that more here in a moment. But the Jewish Christians were going on living as though that covenant was still in place. As though even though, and this is verse 3, what if some were unfaithful? They said, so what if we were unfaithful to the covenant? God's faithful. It doesn't matter if we kept it or not. God's going to keep the covenant. And he did for a long time. But because of their unfaithfulness, Paul wants them to understand, because of that unfaithfulness, God has the right to get out of that contract. In fact, before you ever went into that contract, you go back and you look at the prophecies about Christ, that many of which were before the law of Moses. God knew the time was going to come when that covenant would be set aside. He warned them about it. He told them about it. He had set forth how it was going to happen. And yet, they still clung to it. And Paul says God is indeed faithful. He's faithful to what he said. What he said was far more than just the covenant. What he said was, when the time is right and you have broken this covenant, I'm going to establish another covenant. I'm going to establish one through Christ, through the Messiah. And that's exactly what he's done. So Paul continues to deal with kind of these questions and these ideals that the Jewish Christians would throw back at him. And so we drop down to verse 7. Romans chapter 3, beginning verse 7. And Paul says, some might argue, if my falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and so increases his glory, why am I still condemned as a sinner? So here's the question that they're asking there in that verse before we read further. If my badness makes God look better, why do I get punished for making God look good? Paul's he's going to deal with this more later in Romans chapter 6. So we'll save the bulk of the discussion of it for when we get to Romans 6. But that's the premise that he's introducing here in Romans chapter 3, verse 7. Verse 8, he says, why not say, as some slanderously claim that we say, let us do evil that good may result. Their condemnation is just. Now this is the same thing that Paul's going to say in Romans chapter 6. Shall we sin so that grace may abound? But he introduces here, there are some who claim that's what Paul is teaching. When Paul says you don't have to keep the law of Moses, you don't have to keep the law of works. We live under a law of faith. They say, look, Paul, he's teaching the sacrilege. He's teaching we don't have to live right. We just have to have faith. So that's what Paul is setting up to deal with, this accusation that that's what he's teaching. Because that is not at all what Paul is trying to teach. Paul is trying to explain how we all arrive at one place, under one law, and how that law works. And so, as he does this question, shall we sin to make God look better? The answer the whole time is going to be no. So as we think about the law of Moses, and we're going to have to do a little bit of clarification here on some terms as we go through this. As Peter said, Paul's writing is sometimes hard to understand because of the way that he words things. Now, it's not intended to be hard. It's not trying to hide things. It's just, as I've tried to explain it before, it's just Paul's stream of thought way of writing. He begins saying something and he thinks, oh, somebody's going to think this about what I said. And so right there in the middle of the statement, you might think this, but this is not. And then he goes back to finish his thought. And we have some of that here. And so Paul kind of, he's talking about the law of Moses, law of works. Then he's talking about faith, law of faith. And so sometimes as we go through the book of Romans, it starts getting a little confusing. What law is Paul talking about when he says law? And so we're going to try to clarify that initially, and then as we go through, clarifying each of those instances. Well, let's look at verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law we become conscious of our sin. So what's Paul talking about here when he talks about the law? A law, he says, speaks to those who are under the law. About the best analogy I can come up with to kind of help explain this, the United States has a national set of laws. If you live in the United States, if you're visiting in the United States, you are expected to live in accordance with that set of laws. If you're in Spain, the laws of the United States really don't apply. The laws of Spain apply, whether you live there or whether you're visiting there. There are things you can do when in Spain that you can't do in the United States because it's legal there, but it's not legal here, according to the law. Within the United States, we have our individual states. Our states have laws, which are sometimes different from state to state. Counties within a state, cities within those counties. You understand where I'm saying here? Depending on where you live or are visiting, that's the laws that you're under. Well, the Jews had lived under the law of Moses. It was given to them for that specific purpose, for them to live under it, under that covenant as God's chosen people. And if they were going to be God's people, they had to live under those laws. If an outsider, as I said earlier, wanted to be a part of that covenant, he had to submit himself to those laws. If he was a male, he had to become circumcised. He had to begin keeping the feasts, the rituals, the fastings, the sacrifices, all of those things. But all of that put him under the covenant, the law of Moses. God, as he has brought about this change of covenant that we're talking about, has not said, okay, I'm keeping all of that covenant intact, and I'm just bringing everybody else into it. He said, you broke the covenant. I'm setting that covenant aside. Here is the new covenant in Christ that everybody has opportunity to live under. This is the set of laws. This is the law of faith. This is the law that everybody has to answer to. In some ways, it's really not a new covenant. It is in that it adds the part about Christ. See, the law of faith is the law that's been in place from the beginning. The law of faith is what Adam and Eve lived under in the garden. They were given the law of God. They were told, here's what God expects of you. Be faithful to God, faithful to his commands. They failed in it. They came back. Noah lived under the law of faith. It was through faith he built the ark. It was through faith that he and his family were saved on that ark when the rest of the world perished because of their lack of faith, because of their lack of obedience. Abraham lived under a covenant of faith before God established the law of Moses and that covenant later on. Today, and we saw this in our faith series, we are once again living under the law of faith that says, believe what God tells you, do what God tells you, live in obedience to God. With that, we don't have to offer all those sacrifices. We don't have to go to a priest. We don't have to, all those things that were spelled out in the old law. But a lot of those things in the old law are restated as far as no idols, love your neighbor, all those different things, the core components that have always been God's law are still God's law. And so Paul is trying to get them to understand the specifics of the law of Moses, the specifics to that covenant, were for the purpose of teaching you what was to come. To teach you about what is going to make this new covenant with Christ something special, something different. You're going to understand the cost of sin. You're going to understand what's right and wrong because of the law of Moses. You're going to understand what it means to have a sacrifice. And so you're going to understand the value of what Jesus is going to do when he comes. And so we pick up again with verse 21. Now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. The righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There's no difference between Jew and Gentile. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. And God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be just, and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. The law of Moses taught the righteousness of God as it was to be lived by the people. But the people couldn't live by it. The problem was not with God. The problem was not with the law. The problem was with the people. Their inability, their hardness of heart, their willfulness, their selfishness, all those things that still cause us problems in our obedience with Christ. When Jesus came, he was the only one who had been able to keep the law of Moses perfectly. The only one without sin. And so in the process of keeping the law, he displayed the full faithfulness of God and the faithfulness that God looks for in man. In doing so, he displayed the righteousness of God in a way that the written law never could, because we were able to look at it and see it played out in the life of man. In keeping the law of Moses, Jesus opened the door for all to leave that covenant behind and turn to the new covenant in him. He was the sacrifice that finalized. The old law kept looking for, when you sinned, bring this animal without blemish. I've said before, it didn't exist. Every animal has a blemish. They brought the best that they could bring. But regardless, it was an imperfect sacrifice that the Hebrew writer says was incapable of dealing with the sin. Jesus was the perfect lamb. He was the perfect sacrifice, the one that finally fulfilled the demand of the law and pays the price for sin. And so Paul says that covenant's been fulfilled in every regard. Jesus fulfilled it on behalf of man. God fulfilled it on behalf of God. And so now we arrive at a new covenant where people from every nation can come and be under this covenant. And so the earlier question, what advantage is there to being a Jew? Only in that you should be there first, because you already had the knowledge. You had the word, you had the understanding. But whether you came early or whether you came late, the salvation is the same under Christ. We are all equally guilty. The Jew who knew better sinned. The Gentile who didn't know better sinned. All guilty in the sight of God. All deserving of death. All capable of being justified by the sacrifice of Christ. And so we arrive at our final thoughts for this morning. Romans chapter 3, verse 27. Paul says, "Where then is boasting? It is excluded." Because of what law? The law that requires works, law of Moses? No. Because of the law that requires faith. For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles too? Yes. of the Gentiles too. Since there is only one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through the same faith. Do we then nullify the law by this faith? Not at all. Rather, we uphold the law. Paul's conclusion is that we're all in the same boat. There's nobody that can boast. I can't boast about being any greater in the sight of God than anybody else, whether I'm Jew, whether I'm Gentile. I've been equally guilty in the sight of God. And if I'm in Christ, the law of faith, I am equally justified in the sight of God. Paul says, the law of Moses was a law of works. The law of Moses was not about what God was going to do. It was about what man was supposed to do. And man was never able to keep it except for what Jesus did. Our works, our ability to keep the law, whether you're talking law of Moses or even for that matter the law of faith, our ability to keep it will never be what saves us. Because even under the law of faith, we're going to have moments of sin. We're going to have moments of unfaithfulness. But God has provided for that. The law of faith says that we are under God's works. God works through Jesus. God works through our belief and our understanding of that, our obedience to that. Now, like today, Paul addresses that there are those who heard what he said and says, well, you're saying that we don't have to do anything other than have faith. Works don't matter at all. And that's taught today. All you got to do is believe. You can be saved. You don't have to do anything because that's works of man. The law of faith is still a law that has rules, a law that has things that must be done. But you have to look at what that law is to understand who's doing what and what the terms of the contract say, what you do, what it accomplishes. The law of faith says that God does the work of salvation. You believe, you're obedient, and he says baptism is his work that saves you. It's where he applies the blood of Christ to you. And so when we respond in baptism, that's not me working, that's God working. That's the display of my faith. Paul says, there's nothing for me to brag about in that, except to brag about what God has done. But he says that doesn't mean that there's not something that I'm supposed to do. Yes, there are good works that I'm supposed to do. Yes, there are things that I'm supposed to do as part of keeping the law of faith. He said, I'm not saying we don't have to be obedient to God. I'm not saying that there aren't these commandments that we've got to keep. What I'm saying is that we are saved through our faithfulness of, here's what God says to let him do for me. And as a result, I'm going to do these other things to show my faithfulness to God. And so ultimately, Paul says our faithfulness keeps the law. And when he finishes that out, whether we uphold the law, verse 31, he's talking about the law of faith. He's not going back to the law of Moses. There's nothing for us to do there. There's nothing for us to brag about there. There's nothing that we can accomplish there. Everything that is happening under the law of faith. I don't know if all that came out the way it needed to come out. It's a lot there. And it's a lot, in a sense, to wrap your head around. That's why a lot of people get tripped up on this. And trying to unravel it in a short period of time is sometimes difficult. But bear with me, because Paul's got 13 more chapters where he's unraveling this whole process and trying to explain it all and put it all together in a way that we can understand. What is this covenant that we live under? What does God do within that covenant? What do we do in that covenant? How does faith play its role on both sides of that? For today, our takeaway is this. We're all guilty of sin. We all need Jesus Christ. We have a faithful God who has said that he will save us if we are faithful to do what he tells us to do. To allow him to do his work. This morning, if there's something that we can do to assist you in that part of it, of giving yourself to him, then by all means, let us know how we can assist you with that as we stand together and sing. Is calling, the prodigal come without delay. Arrow, hear him.